Establishing a good zero is absolutely critical because it is the first initial control of whether or not you can hit a target. There are many approaches. We're going to detail pretty much all of them here. A mechanical zero is simply mechanically centering the sights. It has no regard to where the barrel happens to point, though on a correctly assembled rifle, it should be fairly close. The only time this makes sense is if you are reassembling sights or if you are setting the rifle up for more precision type shooting, commonly used in competition where you're going to mark the sights so you have a known centered place to start from. In that case, it would also be wise to make sure that that centered setting is going to be pretty close to actual zeros. Examples, the M14 front sight allows you to physically center it. And there are optical mounts that allow you to physically center the optics so that that mechanical centering is going to be pretty close to an actual zero. A bore sight is a visual reference that centers the sight to where the barrel happens to be pointing. You don't need equipment to do this. You can do it by simply peering down the bore. You can also use optical aids or a laser emitter, which is giving you a representation of where the barrel happens to be pointing. You then center the sight to that visual point. This is going to be a better approach than mechanical zeroing most of the time. Regardless, both mechanical zero and a bore sight should only be used if you're doing some kind of initial setup. Any previous zero, including if it was done by somebody else, you're better off starting from there instead. A no-wind zero is a windage setting such that outside of wind conditions, you should have a shot centered for windage, that is, for left and right. There are some variations of this based on different aspects, which we'll get into when we talk about true zeros and event zeros later. A parallel zero is a type of no-wind zero where the aiming device, whether that's an optic or a laser, is offset from the line of the bore. Rather than trying to have them intersect at one specific distance and then be increasingly off every other distance, you try to have the line of sight or the laser to be parallel to the line of bore, understanding that it's going to have an effect on your no-wind setting. In other words, you're going to be a known amount off to the left or right, but it should be consistent at every distance. An elevation zero is the up and down adjustment necessary to hit a target at a given distance for your particular rifle and ammunition combination. This can either be dialed on to the sight, which works for both iron sights and optics, or it could make use of a portion of the stadia that's marked for hitting at a given distance. A point blank zero, sometimes also called a battle sight zero or BZO, is a type of no wind and elevation zero such that for the expected size of target at most typical expected engagement distances, particulars can be ignored. You can hold center and be reasonable that you're going to get a hit on that particular target. The doctrine on this has changed over the years and different people have differing ideas, but the concept is that it's an elevation and no wind setting such that for many reasonable distance shots you can aim center and go ahead and shoot. A more specialized kind of BZO might be called a maximum ordnance or danger space zero. This was used in the sniper community, particularly with mil dot type reticles. With a zero, on the center of the stadia set for 600, the mill dots up and down can be used for holdovers or hold unders to get a much wider range of elevation holds without having to make adjustments to the sight. So you can engage targets at much varied distances without having to adjust the sight. One way to combine some of these ideas into a field practical approach is an elevation zero with wind hold off. This uses a particular kind of reticle, sometimes referred to as a windplex. The idea here is that the distance to the target probably won't be changing much during the engagement. However, wind conditions, of course, can vary, or the speed laterally, left and right, can as well. So using a windplex type reticle, the idea is that you would dial the elevation and then you'd use the reticle to hold off left or right based on wind condition and or the target's movement. Another approach is to try and avoid having to dial on at all after your initial zero is set. The idea is that you'll use the reticle exclusively for all kinds of hold-offs. That includes for your elevation and also for windage. One of the first optics that did that for military issue, of course, was the ACOG, which is still in service. The more current M157 makes use of a more full mill reticle, sometimes referred to as a Christmas tree style reticle. The idea is that you have a sequence of dots, both for elevation and for windage, that will allow a variety of hold-offs that can be tuned to the specific shot. In the case of the 157, the onboard ballistics computer is helping you identify which dot you should be using for that particular shot. Getting even more particular and precise is the concept of a true zero or event zero. The formal definition of a true zero is an elevation and windage setting required to place a shot or group in the center of a particular target at a specific distance from a specific firing position while under ideal weather conditions. In other words, it's a no-win zero, but for a very specific set of conditions. It is not uncommon in the high-power world, for example, to recognize that even on a target at the same range with the same rifle, you may have some slight variations to your zero based on, say, shooting from a different position or whatnot. For most military personnel or most gun owners, they're not going to recognize that different because they're not shooting precise enough. In competitive shooting, though, where you're trying to maximize your X count, that kind of particular thing is important. The last specification from a true zero or an event zero would be just your zero, where you take all those particulars and then you apply it to the specific wind conditions that you are shooting from, adjusting from there as necessary. I hope this was helpful. This should be a fairly thorough overview. If you think I missed something, hey, go ahead and share it in the comments. Maybe I'll do a part 2. Thanks for watching.